So in the last lessons, we learned the two main hooks that we have access to in React. Now there are other hooks, of course, but the two main hooks are useState and useEffect. So let's use them and change our components so that we use those hooks in place of perhaps class components that can just simply be functional components. So the first one we're going to look at is our sign-in component. Now, in this component, we see that all we really do is leverage our state in order to set the values of our form so that we can fire it off. So let's change this over to using a useState hook. So let's bring in our useState hook. And the first thing we know that we don't need anymore is this constructor. So let's get rid of our constructor and convert our class itself into this hook as well. So of course, any methods that we had on will now have to be their own methods, which is perfectly fine. And then we know that what we're using now is our set credentials, our user credentials and set credentials, which is our useState passing in, let's say it was email, which will be default empty string, and password, which is default empty string. So all we did here was convert our this.state over to useState. Now we still want to use our object because we want our method to still work. So we'll see how we can change that. Well, first we know we're getting this.email sign-in no longer from props, but from the props that we pass in. Right? So we don't have this.props anymore. Instead, we destructure like this. And instead of state now, we get email and password from user credentials. And pretty much our handle submit is now up to date with what we had before. Now, instead of calling this.setState, we're going to call set credentials, right? And we pass the object we want our state to be. So as before, we know the name and the value that we're getting in are going to be dynamic based on the actual form input that we're updating. So all we need to do is actually very similar to when we return our reducer value. We want to spread in all of our user credentials, and then we're just going to update the value that actually needs to be changed. And this will pretty much allow us to use our handle change method the way we have it as well. We see that we get our Google sign-in start from this.props, so we just make sure to destructure it when it comes in as our props, and then we remove our render. And now we just update our methods so that instead of calling this.handleSubmit, we just call the respective method. And instead of calling this.state.password or this.state.email, we can also make sure to destructure off the appropriate values. Now, because we know we're going to use them in these user credentials as well, we can actually do this destructure a little higher, right? And now we'll have access inside of our return. So now if we just pass in email and password, we should have actually pretty much the same component. So let's test and see if this actually worked. So we sign out, we go back to our component, and what we changed was our sign-in component. Whoops, shouldn't have closed that. If we hit our sign-in, we see we trigger our sign-in start, and our sign-in success works. So our component is pretty well converted. So there were just a couple things to keep in mind when doing the conversion. Mainly that instead of destructuring off this.props, we just destructure inside of our function initiation, right? Just like we would when we destructure any props off of a functional component. And then we destructure off of our new state value. So that's pretty much it. That was our sign-in component. Now let's do the same thing for our sign-up component. Very similarly, the sign-up component pretty much calls useState as we did with our sign-in component. So let's bring it in. And let's convert our sign-up over to a functional component. We can copy this object over as well. And similarly, right, we can pretty much call it user credentials, set user credentials, because that's pretty much what they are. And then we'll just instantiate with what we had before as our state. Now, if you wanted to, for example, just instantiate 4 different states for each value and have display name, email, password, confirm password as their own value with their own set value, you can totally do that, but I prefer to keep it this way just because our method already pretty much does the same thing, right? In my opinion, there are less functions that we have to use or write. Now, we will destructure off this from props instead of calling this .props. We will get this from user credentials. And in fact, we're probably going to need this in multiple places in our app. And instead of calling this .setState, we'll call set user credentials. And similarly, we'll spread in any user credentials. And then update the respectively correct value that we need to use it for. We don't need this from state anymore. We don't need our render anymore. And we just need to make sure that we're not referencing the wrong methods. So we gotta, of course, update these as well to their own functions, whereas before they were class methods. And now we can just remove this dot. And that's pretty much the conversion. So if we go back to our application, we can sign out again. And let's sign in with a new user, or sign up with a new user. So let's just say mkzz, right? mkzz@gmail.com, just fake emails. Before we sign up start, sign up success, sign in success. Our component works the same. Our sagas are still working. Everything is properly converted. So that's pretty easy. With our useState hook that we just learned, we were able to quickly convert our components over into these functional components that call useState instead. And it was a pretty simple change, right? It wasn't that significant. Now, if we need to leverage more state, right, we can simply just either make new states using useState, or if we wanted more properties, we can just add them here. So all in all, it was pretty easy to make this change. Now in the next lesson, let's actually see a little bit more of a complicated case in using useEffect.